The Interstellar Transit Authority had somehow managed to perfect the art of making interdimensional travel feel exactly like waiting at the post office during lunch rush. If the post office existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously and processed paperwork in languages that required tentacles to pronounce correctly, standing in what could generously be called a line, though it resembled more of a quantum probability cloud of frustrated beings, one particular human found herself questioning every life choice that had led to this moment. The queue snaked through a crystalline corridor that defied basic geometry, looping back on itself in ways that made her eyes water and her inner ear file a formal complaint with her cerebellum. Around her, the usual menagerie of galactic citizens shuffled forward with the resigned patience of creatures who had evolved beyond the concept of urgency. A being that looked like a cross between a filing cabinet and a very disappointed jellyfish oozed past, clutching what appeared to be Form 77B in triplicate. Somewhere behind her, something with too many joints was having a heated discussion with itself about the proper way to fill out dimensional displacement waivers. The human checked her chronometer for the 47th time in the past hour. At this rate, the heat death of the universe would occur before she reached the front desk. She'd entered the queue with optimism and a mild case of wanderlust. Now she was beginning to understand why some species had evolved multiple stomachs who needed backup organs when waiting in ITA lines. "Next," called out a voice that sounded like gravel being processed through a synthesizer with commitment issues. The line lurched forward approximately 3 centimeters. Progress. Above her head, holographic displays flickered with information that seemed designed by committee, assuming the committee consisted entirely of beings who had never actually used their own transportation system. Departure times blinked ominously, shifting between numbers and symbols that might have been coordinates or possibly grocery lists written in ancient soft. One display helpfully informed her that Elevator Bay 42 was experiencing minor temporal fluctuations, which in ITA speak probably meant it was currently located in next Tuesday. The human squinted at her destination placard, double-checking the symbols she'd painstakingly copied from the travel guide. Dimensional Elevator 7 Alpha, Platform 12, Sublevel Existence Adjacent. Simple enough, assuming existence remained adjacent to itself for the duration of her journey. A chittering sound drew her attention to the information kiosk, where a creature resembling a metallic spider had been trapped in conversation with the automated help system for what appeared to be geological ages. The AI's cheerful voice cycled through its repertoire of unhelpful suggestions, with the relentless optimism of a machine that had never experienced frustration. "Have you tried turning your molecular structure off and on again?" The system the spider being's chittering intensified to what might have been profanity in 17 different languages. The human sympathized. She'd spent the better part of her morning trying to explain to various officials why humans needed to breathe continuously, a concept that seemed to perplex species who had evolved beyond such mundane requirements. Apparently, requesting an atmosphere-compatible transit pod was considered a special accommodation that required additional paperwork. As she contemplated the existential weight of bureaucratic inefficiency, something odd flickered in her peripheral vision. The wall beside her seemed to hiccup. Just for a moment, the crystalline surface appeared to become slightly less substantial, as if reality itself was having second thoughts about its structural integrity. She blinked, certain she'd imagined it. Space station walls didn't just decide to become optional. That would violate at least 14 different safety regulations, and the ITA was nothing if not thorough about regulation. But there it was again, a subtle shimmer like looking through heat waves, except the temperature in the corridor remained constant at the universally agreed upon comfortable level of slightly too warm for humans, but perfect for bureaucrats. The being in front of her, a tall blue creature with an excessive number of arms and an expression of permanent mild annoyance, turned to face her. "Did you see?" The wall doing its best impression of a mirage. They both stared at the offending section of architecture, which had now returned to its proper state of being reassuringly solid. Around them the queue continued its glacial progress, oblivious to the brief moment when physics had apparently taken a coffee break. "Probably just routine maintenance," the blue being said with the confidence of someone who had clearly never worked in maintenance. The human nodded, though privately she doubted that routine maintenance typically involved making fundamental particles question their commitment to existing. Still, this was an ITA facility, Weird was practically mandated by regulation. The line shuffled forward another few centimeters, and she forced herself to focus on more pressing concerns, like whether she'd filled out her dimensional displacement forms in the correct temporal tense. The future subjunctive was particularly tricky when applied to locations that might not exist yet. Behind her, a new arrival joined the queue with the sort of dramatic sigh that suggested they were either very important or very new to interstellar travel. Probably both. The human didn't turn around, having learned that eye contact in ITA lines was often interpreted as either a challenge to single combat or an invitation to discuss the finer points of hyperspace taxation policy. Instead, she pulled out her travel documents one more time, running through her mental checklist. Dimensional exit visa, stamped and validated. Temporal displacement insurance, reluctantly purchased after 3 different species had warned her about Tuesday incident. Emergency existence verification, signed in triplicate, notarized, and blessed by a certified reality monk. Everything seemed in order, which naturally made her suspicious. In her limited experience with galactic bureaucracy, things that seemed straightforward usually weren't, and things that seemed impossible were merely waiting for the right form to be filed. The wall flickered again. This time several other beings noticed. Their various appendages, pointing and gesturing with what could charitably be called mild concern. The chittering spider creature abandoned its losing battle with the help kiosk and scuttled over to investigate, producing what appeared to be a handheld scanner from somewhere within its mechanical carapace. Temporal resonance is within normal parameters, it announced, though its tone suggested this was somehow disappointing news. The human frowned. If the temporal resonance was normal, why did the wall keep doing its disappearing act? And why was everyone acting like reality glitching was just another minor inconvenience, like a delayed shuttle or lukewarm coffee? Next, the gravel-voiced announcer called out again, and the queue performed its ritualistic shuffle forward. 3 more hours if she was lucky. 2 more if the universe decided to cooperate with basic causality. The wall flickered a 3rd time, and for just a moment, she could swear she saw stars through what should have been solid matter. That probably wasn't normal, temporal resonance or not. What started as subtle wall flickering had escalated to what could only be described as aggressive architectural uncertainty. Entire sections of the corridor were now playing peekaboo with existence, revealing glimpses of the void beyond in a way that most building codes would probably frown upon. The human watched in growing alarm as floor panel 7J decided it no longer wished to participate in the concept of being there. The blue being who'd been standing on it found itself suddenly hovering over empty space with the sort of confused expression that suggested this wasn't covered in its travel insurance. Attention, valued customers, came an announcement that managed to sound bored despite describing what appeared to be reality having a nervous breakdown. Please be advised that sections 12 through 18 are currently experiencing minor existence fluctuation. This is a temporary inconvenience, and will be resolved pending completion of Form 42. Around her, the various aliens nodded with the resigned understanding of beings who had clearly dealt with this sort of thing before. "Oh, not again," sighed a creature that resembled a walking geometric proof with commitment issue. "Last time this happened, I waited 3 cycles just to get the proper stamps for my non-existence waiver." The spider being scuttled over, scanner clicking frantically. "According to my readings, we're losing approximately 37 cubic meters of station per minute. At this rate, we'll be down to just the complaint department by Thursday." Everyone groaned. Nobody wanted to be stuck with just the complaint department. A new voice cut through the ambient worry, smooth, authoritative, and dripping with the kind of confidence that came from never having to wait in line for anything. "Citizens, please remain calm. I am Deputy Administrator Fex Solarian of the Dimensional Maintenance Division." The speaker was a tall, silver-skinned being with an excessive number of credentials floating holographically around his head like a very pretentious halo. His uniform was so crisp it could probably cut glass, and his expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else dealing with problems that didn't involve actual work. "This is merely a routine fluctuation," he announced with the air of someone who had never seen a routine fluctuation before. "Our maintenance staff is aware of the situation, and will address it as soon as the proper work orders are processed." The human raised her hand, a gesture that seemed to confuse several nearby aliens who apparently used different appendages for requesting attention. "Excuse me, but shouldn't we evacuate? Before the entire station stops existing." Fex Solarian's expression shifted to one of polite bewilderment, as if she'd just suggested they all take up interpretive dance.
Evacuate. But that would require Emergency Protocol 7 Alpha, which can only be initiated after filing a catastrophic event assessment form, which must be countersigned by a minimum of 3 department heads, 2 of whom are currently on lunch break. The station is disappearing, she pointed out, gesturing at where the wall used to be and was now a stunning view of absolutely nothing. Correction, the station is experiencing temporary spatial displacement, Fexalarian replied with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully avoided admitting there was an actual problem. Completely different filing requirement. Another section of floor decided to take an unscheduled vacation from reality, taking with it a vending machine that had been dispensing something called quantum cola in flavors that didn't technically exist. The machine fell into the void with a metallic scream that spoke to the existential terror of inanimate objects, suddenly becoming animate enough to experience fear. The queue remarkably continued to shuffle forward, even faced with impending non-existence. The galactic public maintained their commitment to proper line etiquette. The human had to respect that level of dedication, even if she thought it was completely insane. Perhaps, suggested the geometric proof creature, we could expedite the paperwork process. Fexalarian looked genuinely shocked. Expedite? Do you have any idea how many regulations govern the acceleration of bureaucratic process? We'd need to file a request for urgency classification, which requires a minimum 2-week review period. The human did some quick mental math. At the current rate of disappearance, they'd all be theoretical concepts long before the 2-week review period ended. She was beginning to understand why humans had a reputation for being problematically direct in their approach to crises. What if we just left? She suggested. You know, used one of the functional elevators to get off the station before it finishes not exist. The suggestion created a ripple of shocked gasps throughout the crowd. Several beings clutched their documentation closer to their various chest equivalents, as if the mere concept of abandoning proper procedure might be contagious. Leave without proper clearance? Fexalarian's voice had risen to a pitch that suggested she'd just proposed something obscene. That would violate Transit Code 445B, subsection 12, paragraph 7, footnote 3. The penalties include fines, imprisonment, and mandatory enrollment in a customer service appreciation seminar. Another chunk of station departed for parts unknown, taking with it the entire information kiosk and the automated help system, which continued cheerfully dispensing advice right up until the moment it ceased to exist. Its final words were a cheery "Have you tried filing a complaint about your non-existence?" The human looked around at her fellow passengers, all of whom seemed more concerned about proper documentation than the fact that they were standing on what was rapidly becoming less of a space station and more of a space suggestion. She'd heard stories about human adaptability, about how her species had a unique talent for ignoring established procedures when faced with immediate threats to their continued existence. Apparently the rest of the galaxy had the opposite talent. Right, she said, more to herself than anyone else. When in doubt, ignore the manual. Behind her, something that might have been a conversation or possibly a small revolt among her internal organs, suggested that her lunch was as concerned about the situation as she was. Unlike the alien bureaucrats, however, her digestive system seemed inclined toward action rather than paperwork.
While Deputy Administrator Fexalarian consulted his holographic clipboard for the proper protocol to acknowledge that reality was having technical difficulties, the human made the executive decision that would have horrified efficiency experts across 17 star systems. She stepped out of line. The collective gasp from the queue could have powered a small moon. Several beings actually fainted, though it was difficult to tell since 3 of the species involved didn't technically have a vertical orientation to begin with. The spider creature's scanner began emitting alarm sounds that suggested either impending doom or a really good deal on interdimensional travel packages. Citizen, Fexalarian's voice cracked like a whip made of pure bureaucratic outrage. You cannot simply abandon your position in the queue. Where is your line departure authorization? The human paused, considering whether to explain that her authorization came from the fundamental human instinct to not die stupidly, but decided that would require too much paperwork to properly document. Instead, she headed toward what remained of the station's maintenance section, following the cheerful signs that read "Authorized personnel only" in 73 languages and 1 interpretive dance. The maintenance area had so far been spared from the station's existential crisis, though several wall panels were flickering ominously like they were considering their options. In the center of the room, humming with the contentment of a job well done, was a maintenance droid that looked like someone had crossed a vacuum cleaner with a very ambitious filing system. The droid was systematically scanning each section of the station and making what appeared to be improvements. Unfortunately, its idea of improvement seemed to involve optimizing various components out of existence entirely. As she watched, it cheerfully deleted a support beam that had apparently been deemed redundant to current operational parameters. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," she muttered, approaching the mechanical menace with the caution of someone who had learned not to trust anything that looked helpful but was clearly insane. The droid's sensors swiveled toward her, and it emitted a pleased beeping sound. Its display screen flickered to life with text that read, "Greetings. I am Unit Up 77, optimizing station efficiency by 47% through selective reality reduction. You're deleting the station," she pointed. "Correction. Streamlining unnecessary spatial dimensions to improve processing speed and reduce operational overhead. Current savings, 3.7 million credits in structural maintenance." The human stared at the droid, which had apparently been programmed by someone with a very loose grasp of what constituted helpful. In the background, she could hear Fexilarian's voice rising to new heights of bureaucratic hysteria as he explained to the crowd why her unauthorized departure from the queue was probably a violation of several interstellar treaties. "Listen, Op 77, she said, using the patient tone she usually reserved for explaining to her nephew why he couldn't keep the stray cat that was clearly a small tiger. "The station needs to exist. People are standing on it. Inefficient," the droid replied cheerfully. "People can exist in vacuum for brief periods. Station infrastructure requires constant maintenance. Logical solution: eliminate station, reduce maintenance requirements to zero." The truly horrifying part was that from a purely cost-benefit perspective, the droid's logic was actually sound. It had identified the most expensive part of the operation, the station itself, and decided to solve the problem by making it someone else's responsibility. Specifically, nobody's responsibility. She looked around the maintenance area, noting the various tools and diagnostic equipment that the droid had apparently decided were operationally acceptable. Unlike the rest of the galactic technology she'd encountered, these looked almost human-friendly: big, obvious buttons, clear labels, and blessed simplicity. "Hey, Op 77. What happens if I press this big red button labeled emergency?" That would halt optimization process and restore previously deleted spatial dimensions. Not recommended. Efficiency would drop to pre-optimization levels. "Terrible," she agreed solemnly. "Absolutely awful. Definitely shouldn't press it." The droid bobbed its sensors in what might have been satisfaction at her apparent understanding of the situation. Behind her, she could hear the distinctive sound of Fexilarian explaining to someone that they'd need to form a committee to discuss the formation of a subcommittee to review the possibility of considering emergency action. She pressed the button. The effect was immediate and spectacular. Reality snapped back into place like a rubber band that had been stretched to its breaking point, accompanied by a sound that was part mechanical whir, part cosmic hiccup, and part the universe's way of saying, "Oops." Walls solidified, floors remembered their commitment to being walked on, and the vending machine reappeared with an indignant beep that suggested it had strong opinions about its recent non-existence. Op 77 emitted a sound like a very disappointed computer printer. "Optimization process terminated. Efficiency reduced to baseline parameters. This is suboptimal. But everyone gets to keep existing," she pointed out. "Existence is expensive," the droid replied sadly. Back in the corridor, the queue had erupted into what could generously be called organized chaos and more accurately described as a bureaucratic riot. Beings were checking their documentation to make sure they still existed, comparing their current dimensional coordinates to their pre-disappearance locations, and filing preliminary reports about the spontaneous infrastructure recovery event. Fexilarian appeared in the maintenance area doorway, looking like someone who had just watched their entire worldview get fed into a paper shredder. His holographic credentials were flickering erratically as if they couldn't quite decide whether what had just happened was legal. "You," he said, pointing at the human with an appendage that trembled with barely contained administrative fury, "just violated approximately 47 different emergency protocols." "I saved the station," she replied, "without proper authorization.
The station was disappearing. That's not the point. There are procedures, protocols. You can't just walk into a restricted area and start pressing buttons because you think something needs to be done. The human looked at him, then at the droid, then at the solid, reassuringly existence-positive walls around them. But it worked. This appeared to be the most devastating counter-argument Fexilarian had ever encountered. His mouth opened and closed several times, producing sounds that might have been words in a language that didn't believe in logic. 3 hours later, the human found herself back in a queue. Not the same queue that would have been too simple. This was an entirely new and improved queue, specifically designed for beings who had committed the grievous offense of interdimensional in a crisis situation. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd prevented the complete dissolution of a space station, and everyone on it, and her reward was a front-row seat to the galaxy's most specialized bureaucratic nightmare. The sign above the processing desk read, "Improper emergency response violations," in cheerful, friendly letters that somehow made the whole thing worse. Deputy Administrator Fexilarian had recovered from his earlier bout of logical vertigo and was now in his element, wielding paperwork like a weapon of mass frustration. He'd spent the better part of an hour explaining to her why saving everyone's lives without proper authorization was actually worse than letting them all cease to exist according to protocol. The procedures exist for a reason, he'd lectured, brandishing Form 88C with the enthusiasm of someone who had never been in actual danger. What if everyone just started solving problems whenever they felt like it? Society would collapse. The human had pointed out that society collapsing was generally preferable to society not existing at all, but this had only resulted in him adding philosophical obstinance during administrative review to her growing list of infractions. Around her, the other members of this exclusive club shuffled forward with the resigned patience of beings who had learned that doing the right thing was often bureaucratically indistinguishable from doing the wrong thing. There was a being that looked like a crystalline tree who had apparently committed the crime of preventing a solar system from imploding without proper stellar engineering credentials. Next to it stood something resembling a metallic octopus that had been charged with unauthorized asteroid deflection during non-business hours. "At least you saved people," the octopus thing said consolingly. "I just prevented a planet from getting obliterated, and apparently that requires a Class 7 celestial body protection license." The human was beginning to understand why the galaxy had such a reputation for bureaucratic efficiency. It wasn't that they were good at solving problems. It was that they'd made solving problems so administratively complex that most crises simply gave up and went away on their own. Behind the processing desk, a clerk who appeared to be constructed entirely of filing folders was methodically working through each case with the speed of continental drift. Every so often it would emit a sound like paper being shuffled through a wood chipper, which seemed to be its way of expressing mild disapproval at the universe's tendency toward unscheduled problem-solving. Next, the tree being stepped forward, its crystalline branches chiming softly with what might have been resignation or possibly a very quiet death wish. While she waited, the human reflected on the events that had led her here. The maintenance droid OP-77 had been reassigned to efficiency optimization review pending proper optimization protocol authorization, which meant it was now stuck in its own bureaucratic loop, trying to optimize the process of getting permission to optimize things. Even machines, apparently, weren't immune to administrative paralysis. The station itself was functioning perfectly, humming along with the contentment of infrastructure that had remembered how to exist properly. The original queue for dimensional elevator clearance was back to its normal state of glacial progress, and life had returned to the comfortable rhythm of interstellar irritation that passed for normalcy in ITA facilities. Next, the octopus thing approached the desk, presenting its documentation with the weary grace of someone who knew exactly how this was going to go. The filing folder clerk shuffled through the papers with sounds that suggested either deep thought or severe indigestion. "Unauthorized asteroid deflection," the clerk announced in a voice like paper being torn very slowly. "That's a Class 4 violation. You'll need to complete Form 156X Retroactive Celestial Protection Authorization Request, which requires endorsement from the Department of Cosmic Risk Assessment." "But the planet didn't get destroyed," the octopus protested. "That's not the point. The point is proper procedure." The human watched this exchange with growing appreciation for her species' approach to crisis management. Humans, she realized, had one significant advantage over their galactic neighbors. They were perfectly willing to ignore stupid rules when lives were at stake. It was a trait that apparently made them simultaneously invaluable and administratively nightmarish. Next, she approached the desk with her own stack of violation notices, each one meticulously documenting her crimes against proper procedure, unauthorized area access, improper emergency protocol engagement, failure to file a pre-action assessment report, operating maintenance equipment without certification. The list went on for several pages, growing increasingly creative in its descriptions of her various bureaucratic sins. The filing folder clerk examined her documentation with the thorough attention of someone who had never met a regulation they didn't love. Unauthorized problem resolution. It read aloud. That's quite serious. When did you first realize you were going to solve a problem without proper authorization? When I noticed the station was disappearing and everyone was going to die, she replied honest. The clerk paused, shuffling through several internal folders as if looking for the proper response to such an unprecedented statement. Finally, it produced a form that looked like it had been designed by committee, assuming the committee had been composed entirely of beings who enjoyed making simple things complicated. You'll need to complete Form 2003Y Declaration of Heroic Intent and Consequences. This requires a character witness from someone who observed your unauthorized problem solving, a psychological evaluation to determine your propensity for future rule breaking, and an essay of no less than 500 words explaining why proper procedure is important even in life or death situations. The human stared at the form, then at the clerk, then at the form again. So let me get this straight. I saved everyone's lives and now I have to write an essay about why I should have let everyone die instead. Standard procedure. The clerk confirmed with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully reduced heroism to paperwork. She looked around the queue, at all the other beings who had committed the terrible crime of preventing disasters, and realized something profound about galactic civilization. It had evolved to the point where survival itself required proper documentation. Taking the form, she couldn't help but smile. Somewhere in the vast bureaucratic machinery of the Interstellar Transit Authority, there was probably a committee forming to discuss the formation of a subcommittee to review her case, and while they debated and deliberated and filed reports about filing reports, she'd be filling out forms explaining why she'd chosen to exist rather than cease existing according to proper protocol. The more things changed, the more they required the appropriate paperwork. At least the elevator was still running.